But they're really criticizing science because I represent science.
So when some individual declares themselves science, they have in fact declared themselves the Antichrist of science. Hey there, friends, families, and foes of Dad Saves America. It's hard to end this week without spending a little time with our good friend, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Dr. Fauci, as you probably know, has been in the news because he was recently grilled in a congressional hearing, but I think it represents a really useful moment to reflect on our obsession with experts and the challenges that it poses for us, because I think we're all grappling in this time with how to know what and who to trust. And Dr. Fauci is, in a certain sense, maybe the most perfect avatar for exploring those challenges. First thing I think it's always important to remember is that Dr. Fauci, for a time, was the hero of America. Time magazine called him Guardian of the Year. He also got the 100 most influential people, also on Time. Time is sort of a good litmus test for what the kind of largely unthinking elite class in our country thinks. I think the cultural moment was maybe at its most intense when Brad Pitt played Dr. Fauci on SNL.
Good evening. I'm Dr. Anthony Fauci.
So, this was what Dr. Fauci represented actually at the time. Not only was he America's epidemiologist, he was also a foil to President Trump, who is prone towards bombastic statements that are often false. This was the image of Dr. Fauci. But as time passed on, I think we all came to understand that the picture was a little more complicated and that Dr. Fauci represents something, shall we say, a little more sinister. And I don't necessarily mean his role in perhaps funding the virus itself or trying to cover up its origins or any other number of things that have been talked about ad nauseum and that are probably correct. It's useful to play this little hits reel of the years that passed since Brad Pitt donned the wig.
But they're really criticizing science because I represent science.
If you're vaccinated, you really don't need to worry about getting it in a way that's serious or transmitting it.
That is true. That is correct, Chris. It'll either protect you completely against infection, and the chances are very likely that you'll not be able to transmit it to other people. The risk is extremely low of transmitting it to anybody else. Full stop. Vaccinated people are clearly capable of transmitting the infection. When you're in the middle of an outbreak, wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better. If people are not wearing masks, then maybe we should be mandating it. I often myself wear 2 masks.
And I'm quoting you now, at the population level, masks work at the margins maybe 10%. To hear that they only work at the margins maybe 10% would make a lot of people ask, okay, then why was I wearing a mask?
But masks work extra well to cover your identity while you're protesting in the streets at Columbia University.
You're really attacking not only Dr. Anthony Fauci, you're attacking science when you say that this is going to go away tomorrow like that.
He is the perfect avatar for a discussion about elite delusion, precisely because he calls upon us to look at him as the avatar of elite delusion. To call yourself science is to be a kind of peak self-owning. It is the ultimate self-destruction of your entire worldview, because science can't be embodied in a person. Science is a process, and one of the most important parts of the process of science is that there is no final authority. Science is always provisional, which is to say, it is whatever we think we understand now is always up for discussion, to be reinvestigated and overturned. So when some individual declares themselves science or the authority in science or the avatar for science, they have in fact declared themselves the Antichrist of science. They are the anti-science. They are the enemy of everything that science represents. I think when he changed his mind honestly, as opposed to in the name of manipulative propaganda, I don't fault him for that. I don't fault him or any of the elected officials, frankly, for changing their position as information emerged. Just on a personal level, When the first vaccines came out and they were deployed in Israel, I paid close attention to that. I have family members that are immune compromised, and I was actually quick to get the Pfizer vaccine because it appeared in the very early stage out of the gate to be truly highly effective. Now, it was a very short time frame, but I was willing to make that leap at the time, mostly for my family, but I felt pretty good about it at the time. And I didn't get vaccine injured or anything like that. So the fact that that itself changed, the fact that the efficacy of these shots decreased over time, I can understand. So long as it was actually like new learning along the way instead of lying to the public about things that were already well established and well known, such as claiming that, for example, COVID couldn't possibly have come from a lab. This is the problem we encounter now, is that it's almost impossible to have a nuanced conversation about this because the actions of the elite, of which Dr. Fauci represents, have so thoroughly invalidated themselves, not just by calling themselves science, but seeking to censor those who would be critical, which is the actual process of science itself. Being critical of the current order is part of the scientific process. It's part of the learning process of trial and error, hypothesis, test, experiment, the whole thing. That's rendered our ability to trust any of these people about at zero. We have now become pure engines of ideological and mood affiliation. Are you on my team? Then I trust you. If you're not on my team, then you're a villain and I don't trust you. So that's just tribalism now. I wanted to actually share a video that came out a couple months ago that touches on, I think, an even more difficult to grapple with aspect of our relationship to experts, expertise, and frankly, the sort of the elite class of intellectuals in our society. And that is that it appears pretty robust.
What causes delusion? The prevailing view is that people adopt false beliefs because they're too stupid or ignorant to grasp the truth. But just as often, the opposite is true. Many delusions prey not on dim minds, but on bright ones. And this has serious implications for education, society, and you personally.
To summarize it, what's going on here is that we as a creature have multiple modes that we operate in. We survive through being tribal, and we are fundamentally social. Jonathan Haidt talks about this in his book, The Righteous Mind. And what he lays out is essentially an analogy, a model for what humans are. He says that our rationality is like the rider atop an elephant. And that elephant is our intuition, what feels right, our gut. And the rider, whose influence over the path of the elephant is quite small, is our rational faculty, our IQ, our intelligence. And so what appears to be true is that the smarter you get, the better your little rider is at rationalizing the path your elephant wants to go. And that's mostly what happens. Our rational faculties tend to get used in the service of our intuitive, emotional gut impulses. And that is the way a lot of human decision making works. And it begs the question, how the hell are we all still here? Because if we're so fundamentally irrational and driven just by our emotions and our intuitions, how is it that we make any progress? If we somehow manage to understand things about the world such that we can build our civilization and our technology and make progress, the way we do that is a continual bottom-up process of discovery, of trial and error. And in particular, we have to do that within circles of trust where we can all agree, okay, we're going to try to challenge ourselves together. And that is how progress actually happens. That is how information that appears to be true gets discovered. That is science. And the problem we've encountered now is that our society, as it has become more complex, has developed essentially a new kind of tribalism. I think what we have to do with it is grapple with the nature of expertise itself and what the role of any individual expert should ever be allowed to play in our social order. Because it turns out that when someone holds a really radical idea and most people hear that and think it sounds crazy, they're probably right. Or they're probably at least closer to right. And this reminds me of this paper by my favorite economist, Friedrich Hayek, called The Intellectuals and Socialism. And what Hayek lays out in this, and I bring this up because there is a deep connection here. What Dr. Fauci became in our society, Dr. Fauci and the small cohort of people making massive decisions for our entire society. How long should we be locked down in our houses? What is an essential business? How many frozen food bags can we buy from the grocery store today? The amount of centralized decision-making that we experienced in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic was akin to Soviet central planning. We basically decided, let's try communism for a while in the name of defeating a respiratory virus. And we justified it on the basis of our social belief in lab coat wearers, our trust in the intellectual class and the elite. And Hayek writes about this quite profoundly until one begins to list all the professions and activities which belong to the class, the intellectual class. It is difficult to realize how numerous it is, how the scope for activities constantly increases in modern society, and how dependent on it we all have become. The class does not consist of only journalists, teachers, ministers, lecturers, publicists, radio commentators, writers of fiction, cartoonists, and artists, all of whom may be masters of the technique of conveying ideas, but are usually amateurs so far as the substance of what they convey is concerned. And I will admit that applies to me, and I am often guilty as charged. The class also includes many professional men and technicians, such as scientists and doctors, who through their habitual intercourse with the printed word become carriers of new ideas outside their fields, and who, because of their expert knowledge of their own subjects, are listened with respect on most others. This is a really important point, because Dr. Fauci might know a lot about the particular areas of epidemiology that he studied. He doesn't know anything about how to order our society. He is not an expert in planning our entire civilization. No one is. But because these people are smart and articulate and carry with them a credential, we are inclined to believe them. And we pay no attention to the fact that they're actually the most inclined towards ideological bias of anyone in our society. So they're kind of broken from the start. Hayek continues. There is little that the ordinary man of today learns about events or ideas except through the medium of this class. And outside our special fields of work, we are in this respect almost all ordinary men, dependent on our information and instruction on those who make it their job to keep abreast of opinion. It is the intellectuals in this sense who decide what views and opinions are to reach us, which facts are important enough to be told to us, and in what form and from what angle they are to be presented. Whether we shall ever learn of the results of the work of the expert and the original thinker depends mainly upon their decision. And this to me is the part that I think is the most profoundly important critique of Dr. Fauci and of those who claim scientific consensus in any complex system concern, be it politics, climate, the economy, or epidemiology and healthcare. There is no such thing as a generalized expert of everything. And so the only way we can actually make progress for real is decentralization and competition. It is the battle of ideas. You have to take it upon yourself to engage in the trial and error process, the science of life. And when you do, and when you uncover things that feel correct in the context of what you understand about your life, your circumstances, what Hayek would call the particular details of time and place, you are the expert of that moment. And in healthcare in particular, I think this is profoundly true. We talk about healthcare like it's Grey's Anatomy, like there's a book you can read, and then you've got it all. But that is so far from the truth, and I come from a family of doctors, which doesn't make me an expert in anything other than the limitations of what doctors know. We all have experienced in varying degrees the sense in which we understand our bodies better than anyone else. And there is often the case that our diagnosis is incredibly difficult, and we go to the experts and no one knows what's going on, or we're told we're wrong, or we're told we're crazy, or it's all in our head. And then eventually it turns out we were right. That is our subjective experience as an individual. And that is what we are. We are individuals with subjective experience trying to live together. That is the structure of actual reality. That is why communism can't work even in theory. That's why the pandemic was such a disaster. That's why this instance, where in theory, on the blackboard of economists, our government should have been stepping up to the plate to prove its value. They failed spectacularly. They couldn't do anything but fail. Because on the blackboard, a highly infectious respiratory disease is a perfect example of what's called an externality. I can get you sick even though you didn't do anything to deserve it. I have externalized the cost on you. That is a perfect example of what sort of neoclassical economists would say is an externality and therefore the role for government to step in to protect third parties. That's not fair. Government should step in somehow. In practice, as we all saw, the sheer complexity of the society of reality made acting in that environment impossible for central planners. So the FDA failed on every turn. They actually made it harder to get testing. They limited the supply of tests. The CDC actually actively limited the ability to produce hand sanitizer when we, in theory, maybe needed it most. Then we moved from actually banning things that might help to mandating things that might not. That was the flip that happened. We went from nobody should be using this scarce PPE to everyone needs PPE to wait, no, we've actually just stunted the learning of half the children in our society. Maybe we should enforce PPE on people. You can't escape that. It is inescapable. And that is because in a complex world, knowledge is decentralized and always changing, and expertise is always bound by time and place and purpose. We don't have grand experts to plan our lives for us. We have to take ownership and plan for ourselves. That doesn't mean there isn't planning. That doesn't mean that Mr. Libertarian Dad, who wants to see power decentralized to the people, doesn't want any planning or processes to take place. It's about who plans for who. So what the heck are you supposed to do with all this, right? How did I get from Dr. Fauci to Friedrich Hayek? I think at the core of this, and at the core of what I try to do here as much as possible, is take these high-flying ideas and help them empower you. Because I think the power of a thinker like Friedrich Hayek, whose focus is on distributed nature of knowledge, on the limits of central planning and experts, I think the best way to think about that for you and for your life and for your family is that you are the expert of your life and your choices. There is no one that knows what you're capable of more than you. There is no one that knows what's good for you right now more than you. And you should have the confidence in yourself and the ownership in your agency to make use of that and to feel empowered by it. And this is the most important thing we can give our kids, is that knowledge that they have it, that they are their own expert when it comes to what is best for them and what decision they should make next. If you disagree, or if you got something out of this, please leave a comment. You know, I jump in there and try to answer as many as I can. Have a great weekend.